poetry freaks, outdoors, ghost mug for the graveyard school. This might be one of those episodes that goes on and on because the graveyard school is dear to my mortal heart. But let's begin right away with the string of pearls. Oh, I'm put down my mug. Is it gonna be loud? Yes, it is, because the phone is leaning on these pretty bottles. Dream Whip, Song Germs, gonna pull out a phrase for the string of pearls we are assembling. Oh, I got two. Okay, I chose one. French for heavenly. That is an art idea, or a let's keep it. Let's do it. Let's do it. See how it fits in. I was going to say, no, oops, that one missed the culling, but I'm going to roll with it. Roll with it, because that's life. That's poetry, life and death. Here is the poem next up from the last prompt by the dice. In the previous episode, which now I'm like sitting right here, can't remember the name of. Who cares? Okay, the prompt was embalmed in honey by way of candle. Your course nearly run in this honorable world. Stop and eat the honey, nothing but honey, and bathe in it, dear, until you are honeyed inside and out. Then collapse, thus poisoned. Now you are at rest. Bathe again, honeyed in your coffin of stone, submerged for a century until you are candy. Scarcest of healing treats ingested, you are medicine. Your ponderous candle flame leaps, heroic. Embalmed in honey by way of candle, and it was Mad Song. That was the last episode, episode 2. Now we're on episode 3. Let's look at Mellification. I think that the poetic mood, embalmed in honey, which was part of a line from the Decadent Poets, I forget which one. I mean, I had to look into embalming in honey, and it's called Mellification. Check it out. This is just from a general internet search, the thing that pops up with no, if I ever don't give a reference, it's because it just popped up in the Bing search or whatever. Embalming a human body in honey, a practice known as mellification, is a legendary medicinal technique. It involves steeping a human cadaver in honey, and it is detailed in Chinese medical sources. While the concept sounds incredible, it is recorded that men in the Middle East used to submit themselves to be mummified in this way to create a healing concoction. Ancient Greek historian Herodotus also claimed that the Assyrians used honey to embalm. And now from Wikipedia, a mellified man, also known as a human mummy confection, was a legendary medicinal substance created by steeping a human cadaver in honey. The concoction is detailed in Chinese medical sources, including the Ben Cao Gang Mu of the 16th century. Relying on a second-hand account, the text reports a story that some elderly men in Arabia, nearing the end of their lives, would submit themselves to a process of mummification in honey to create a healing confection. This process differed from a simple body donation because of the aspect of self-sacrifice. The mellification process would ideally start before death. The donor would stop eating any food other than honey, going as far as to bathe in the substance. Shortly, the donor's feces and even sweat would consist of honey. When this diet finally proved fatal, the donor's body would be placed in a stone coffin filled with honey. After a century or so, the contents would have turned into a sort of confection reputedly capable of healing broken limbs and other ailments, like internal ailments. I looked further. This confection would then be sold in street markets as a hard-to-find item with a hefty price. And that definitely inspired the poem of today. All right, onward. Wow. While we fixate on mellification, embalming, and honey, I mean, just take a moment. But let's roll the dice for some poetic mood and words. And since it is the Graveyard School episode, these will be sort of morbid moods and words. So the first one is going to require the D20 for poetic mood. I still have my post-it in here to muffle it, although I'm outside. It's not really necessary. 11. Poetic mood is 'tis peace, from a line of graveyard poetry, which we will look at later. Now we need a morbid word. So 'tis peace by way of number 16, lamentable. 'Tis peace, and yet lamentable. So there is the prompt for the poem for the next episode. If you would care to write along, please do so. Send it to me at hipnessandoutrage@gmail.com, and I'll read it on this next episode, or whenever I see it, or whenever you send it, or what have you. All right, read one. I'm not prepared. Let me go find something. I'm back, and I have found glitter and ghosts, and I will read to you Ghost of a Native Poet. Ghost of native poet, pour your songs and whisper as I amble toward sleep. Night shore long and lonely, darkness deep. Here I lie, soul cracked, slip inside, invited. Spew a storm of words into my mind, entwined, benighted. Denied my word cascade, without my fire beguiled. I'm bound in whalebone, penned no longer wild. Release your blazing colors, fill my head, or see my eyes go flat, a doll's and dead. From Glitter and Ghosts. Ghost Stories, Poetry, and Art by Amy Zollers. Amy Zollers McAnally now, as it turns out. And now, we have reached the moment of something intoxicating. There are critters behind me in the grass. I don't know what they are. Maybe they're squirrels. Maybe they're little chipmunks. Well, anyhow, onward, something intoxicating, which at this point is The Graveyard School, from a poet's glossary by Edward Hirsch. Graveyard poets, or churchyard poets. In the second half of the 18th century, a group of melancholy pre-romantic English poets wrote in the shadow of the graveyard. They were night poets who rejected the decorum of the Augustans and foreshadowed Gothic literature. They were sometimes derided as the school of the drowned in tears. Much of it is skulls and coffins, but the mode reached a sublime height in James Thomson's The Season, 1730, Edward Young's Night Thoughts, 1742, and Thomas Gray's Elegy written in a country churchyard, 1751. The graveyard poets were never a formal school, but their dark sensibilities, their feeling for the uncanny, and their spooky supernaturalism helped to create the climate for romantic poetry. Thank you, Edward Hirsch. I love your work. Okay, well, I have with me the Graveyard School Anthology from Valancourt Books. So, in spite of Edward Hirsch saying, my gosh, let's have a car alarm, let's have a siren, let's have a car alarm, I'm waiting for someone to, get it together here, but I think that may not happen. Okay, the car alarm has finally finished its work. Let's look at The Graveyard School, an anthology edited by Jack G. Fuller, comes from Valancourt Books. My copy is damaged. I know I had it in my bag and a water bottle got on it, but it's which makes me sad, but it's such an exquisite book nonetheless. So, Jack G. Fuller describes The Graveyard School as poets with graveyards in mind. Perhaps that's where they write, or they have a window view of a graveyard. Number 2, melancholy musing. Number 3, metaphysical dread, abstract free-floating dread, invoking fear and horror. And 4, funereal contemplation. And then there was a writer in 1975, Peter Thorpe, who wrote 18th century English poetry. He gave 8 points on what makes a graveyard poem, and here we go. Number 1, to remind the reader that you too must die. Number 2, vanity and transitoriness of life. Number 3, the setting, nighttime and a place of burial. Number 4, physical decay after death is sort of ruminated upon. 5, death is the leveler. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, old or young, everybody must face it. Number 6, quote, adopt and maintain an exceedingly gloomy and funereal tone. Number 7, reconcile with death, probably in a Christian way, considering the time and place, England of the 18th century. And number 8, the speaker is in solitude. So those are Peter Thorpe's 8 points on how to make a graveyard poem. If you care to try your hand. All right, not to get all pedantic with lists and rules, but that's a good overview anyway. All right, now, with my lifelong morbid streak, I just love this stuff, and I don't know why. I mean, there's something really calming to me about walking in the cemetery, like following the paths and reading the stones, but then, the same kind of mindset at the middle of the night will just strike entirely differently, like free-floating dread, the sense that death is too near, but also too impossible. It's a threshold we must all cross, but who can kind of understand or imagine it? There will be a moment, then 2 minutes after the moment, when we understand the other side, I guess, maybe a little, while this side goes on without us. Whoa, getting all graveyard school on you. But let's stride onward with a few little extracts. Okay, so we have, to begin with, Thomas Parnell's Night Piece. It's considered the first graveyard school work, according to Voller, written around 1714, 3 years after the death of Parnell's wife, which naturally threw him into deep grief. And I mean, maybe not naturally, I guess everybody's story is different, but he was grieving big time, and 3 years later wrote Night Piece, which I will read from now, pardon me. By all the solemn heaps of fate, and think as softly as you tread above the venerable dead, time was, like thee, they life possessed, and time shall be that thou shalt rest. Those with the bending osier bound, that nameless heave the crumbled ground, quick to the glancing thought disclose, where toil and poverty repose. And a little bit later in the piece, osier, by the way, is a willow tree bending to the ground. Are senseless of the fame they give. Ha! While I gaze, pale Cynthia fades. That's the moon. I just learned that. Greek poetic speak for the moon is Cynthia. The bursting earth unveils the shades, all slow and wan and wrapped with shrouds. They rise in visionary crowds, and all with sober accent cry, think, mortal, what it is to die. Now from yon black and funeral yew that bathes a charnel house with dew. Methinks I hear a voice begin, ye ravens, cease your croaking din, ye tolling clocks, no time resound o'er the long lake and midnight ground. It sends a peal of hollow groans, thus speaking from among the bones. When men my scythe and darts supply, how great a king of fears am I. They view me like the last of things, they make and then they dread my stings. Fools, if you less provoked your fears, no more my spectre form appears. Death's but a path that must be trod, if man would ever pass to God. A port of calms, a state of ease, from the rough rage of swelling seas. Thank you, Mr. Thomas Parnell. Pardon me. Next we have Robert Blair, a Scottish minister and poet, and author of The Grave. Now you could call him a founding graveyard poet of the graveyard school, and he did owe much to our friend Thomas Parnell, especially Night Thoughts, says Voller. It borrows all of Parnell's major themes, the invocation of a sublime horror in the graveyard imagery, including the manifestation of ghosts and the yew trees of the churchyard, the description of funereal pomp and pageantry, the grave as the great leveler of class distinction. Both poems even begin by the light of a sickly taper. Blair's contribution beyond the expansion of those themes, Parnell's poem of 90 lines is extended to over 760 by Blair, is the much fuller elaboration in an evangelical mode, which Parnell did not really utilize. So Blair does go on and gets evangelical with it. 767 lines. It takes up 25 pages in the anthology. How does one choose a sample? From The Grave, starting halfway through line number 9. The grave, dread thing, men shiver when thou'rt named. Nature appalled shakes off her wonted firmness. Ah, how dark thy long extended realms and rueful wastes, where naught but silence reigns, and night, dark as was chaos ere the infant sun was rolled together or had tried his beams athwart the gloom profound. The sickly taper, by glimmering through thy glow-browed mist vaults, furred round with moldy damps and ropey slime, lets fall a supernumerary horror, and only serves to make thy night more irksome. Wowie zowie. Furred round with moldy damps and ropey slime. Good night, children. Okay, speaking of children, from Robert Blair's The Grave, well then, there now. I'm gonna go to page 47 and just read a little fun part. I think it's fun. Oft in the lone churchyard at night I've seen by glimpse of moonshine checkering through the trees the schoolboy, with his satchel in hand, whistling aloud to bear his courage up, and lightly tripping o'er the long flat stones, with nettle skirted and with moss o'ergrown, that tell in homely phrase who lie below. Sudden he starts and hears, or thinks he hears, the sound of something purring at his heels. Full fast he flies, and dares not look behind him, till out of breath he overtakes his fellows, who gather round and wonder at the tale of horrid apparition, tall and ghastly, that walks at dead of night, or takes his stand o'er some new opened grave, and strange to tell, he vanishes at crowing of the cock. Every time he invokes the words, the grave, they're in parentheses and capitalized. Not parentheses, italics. Italics and capitalized. Wow. Thank you, Robert Blair. Blair covers a lot of ground, burial ground, addressing warriors, young lovers, healers and misers, suicides, royalty, all who must go to the grave. He pleads with the dead for some hint of the secrets of the afterlife, and he sort of yells at the grave itself for spoiling everything. Last graveyard poet, not generally, there are many of them, but the last we'll look at in this episode is Elizabeth Carter, and this chick is the coolest. Living from 1717 to 1806, a fervent intellectual, obsessed with her studies. She would want to start early in the morning every day with her studies, like between 4 and 5 a.m. So she had a bell installed at the head of her bed, which the local sexton rang every morning when he awoke to begin his duties. He'd just ring the bell, wake her up, and she would get to studying, and she'd stay up till midnight studying. She was addicted to snuff and green tea, which helped her stay awake, but gave her painful headaches later in life. Carter belonged to the Bluestockings, a group of educated, literary, upper-class intellectual women who met regularly to discuss literature and culture, and they were roundly mocked by their male counterparts. Says Fuller, the precarious position of such women in Carter's time is evidenced in two remarks on Carter by Samuel Johnson, the leading intellectual figure of his age. He once praised Carter's knowledge of Greek as being better than that of anyone he knew, but also once said, after hearing another woman praised for her learning, a man is in general better pleased when he has a good dinner upon his table than when his wife talks Greek. My old friend, Mrs. Carter, could make a pudding as well as translate Epictetus from the Greek, and work a handkerchief as well as compose a poem. Carter, who never married, Johnson's missus was a token of respect, today is remembered more for her poems than for her handkerchiefs, and her translations more than her puddings. Yeah, she is. So let's hear a few lines from Carter's Ode to Melancholy, followed by an intense dream she once had. All right, here we are, back to the Graveyard School. Ode to Melancholy by Elizabeth Carter. Some lines. Come, melancholy, silent power, companion of my lonely hour, to sober thought confined, thou sweetly sad ideal guest, in all thy soothing charms confessed, indulge my pensive mind. Through yon dark grove of mournful yews, with solitary steps I muse, by thy direction led. Here, cold to pleasure's tempting forms, consociate with my sister worms, and mingle with the dead. Ye midnight horrors, awful gloom, ye silent regions of the tomb, my future peaceful bed. Here shall my weary eyes be closed, and every sorrow lie reposed in death's refreshing shade. And she goes on for several more lines. That poem is about 78 lines long, but there is a section on the next couple of pages that says, Elizabeth Carter, Rambler 44. The Rambler was a twice-weekly magazine produced by Samuel Johnson from 1750 to 1752, and Carter, the only author to have more than one contribution, wrote numbers 44 and 100. So in number 44, she talks about a dream she had. I had lately a very remarkable dream which made so strong an impression on me that I remember it every word. Methought I was in the midst of a very entertaining set of company, and extremely delighted in attending to a lively conversation, when on a sudden I perceived one of the most shocking figures imagination can frame advancing towards me. She was dressed in black, her skin was contracted into 1,000 wrinkles, her eyes sunk deep in her head, and her complexion pale and livid as the countenance of death. Her looks were filled with terror and unrelenting severity, and her hands armed with whips and scorpions. As soon as she came near, with a horrid frown and a voice that chilled my very blood, she bid me follow her. I obeyed, and she led me through rugged paths beset with briars and thorns into a deep solitary valley. Wherever she passed, the fading verdure withered beneath her steps. Her pestilential breath infected the air with malignant vapors, obscured the luster of the sun, and involved the fair face of heaven in universal gloom. Dismal howlings resounded through the forest. From every baleful tree, the night raven uttered his dreadful note. and the prospect was filled with desolation and horror. In the midst of this tremendous scene, my execrable guide addressed me in the following manner. I'm sorry, I don't know that word. Retire with me, O rash, unthinking mortal, from the vain allurements of a deceitful world, and learn that pleasure was not designed the portion of human life. Man was born to mourn and to be wretched. This is the condition of all below the stars, and whoever endeavors to oppose it acts in contradiction to the will of heaven. Fly, then, from the fatal enchantments of youth and social delight, and here consecrate the solitary hours to lamentation and woe. Misery is the duty of all sublunary beings, and every enjoyment is an offense to the deity, who is to be worshipped only by the mortification of every sense of pleasure, and the everlasting exercise of sighs and tears. Well, that quite sunk her spirits, and she was ready to die. And then she meets another figure who is much more pleasant to behold, the figure of religion. But I do like that terrifying dream at the terrifying part. All right, so that is our girl, Elizabeth Carter, and that is the Graveyard School, which may appear in a second volume, I suppose. So to say, a second part, because I really get a kick out of it. Now, okay, so that's all we've got for today, but we are going to end on a song. I did not mean to write a spleen song, but I did. It was funny. I was telling my man about the whole phenomenon of the 3 poems called Spleen. So he got this is a new podcast, he got them crossed in his mind. He's like, so you're gonna write a spleen song? Because I always write a song for podcast in A minor when I'm doing a subject. And I was like, no. And then, like, you know, that night the song, or maybe even 5 minutes later, I don't recall specifically, but like it just almost fully formed in my mind thanks to that wonderful anatomical definition from the first episode of Poetry Freaks, 3 songs called Spleen. So I'm gonna end us on that song. I'm going to play it. It's going to play us out along with the theme that plays us out. I'm just going to say, Graveyard School. You know, don't get too hung up about death. Just, you know, kind of enjoy life, the pleasures of life, and the poetry of life. And we'll catch you later, Poetry Freaks. Bye-bye. The spleen is purple, man. Your spleen is purple, man. And its charity glows like a coffin of O's. It's purple, man. It's elderberry jam, and it's cleaning your blood right now. Your spleen is purple, man, a plum cordial, man, and it cleans your blood and recycles your iron. And it's purple, man. The spleen is purple, man, and it hugs your tummy and it keeps you in health. It stores extra blood in case of hemorrhagic shock, and it cradles your poetic malaise. The spleen is purple, man. Your spleen is purple, man, and its largest flows like a river of yo-yos. It's purple jack, and its bile is black, and in poetry it releases your melancholy spleen attack. Time to dress in black, and it's no surprise the doldrums in your eyes.